What if the only thing standing between your child and a life sentence was you? What if the text that proved his guilt wasn't even sent by his hands? And what if the system built to protect you decided, before the first hearing, that your family was easier to file away than to fight for? All rise. The bailiff's voice ricochets off the wood panels of Branch County Courtroom 2B. Fluorescent lights hum. A clock ticks too loudly, like it wants to be heard or whispers. On the defense table, a 19-year-old kid named Jordan. Hale stares at the judge, then cuts his eyes to the second row where his mother sits. Lena Hale doesn't blink. She's clutching a cheap spiral notebook, the kind you buy in August for back-to-school sales. The front cover is bent. The edges are frayed. Inside it is everything. Dates, names, questions nobody wanted to ask. The judge lifts a paper. Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict? 12 faces look anywhere, but at the boy. Foreperson clears his throat. We have, Your Honor. Lena presses her palm against her chest as if she can slow her heart by hand. She thinks about the message she left on an anonymous tip line at 2:17 a.m., the one that said, check the 2 missing minutes on the Ridgemark camera between 10:41 and 10:43. You're not seeing what you think you're seeing. She thinks about the dispatcher log she photographed on her phone, exactly one line that didn't match the official report. And she thinks about the red baseball cap with a broken brim, the one that shows up in the background of a photograph. She is not supposed to have. Before you say that word, she whispers to no one, please look again. The foreperson opens his mouth. Freeze. Let me take you back to the night this began, when Maple Ridge, Pennsylvania still felt like the kind of suburban town where porch lights stayed on for decoration, not defense. It was the last Friday of the school year. Seniors were loud, some were bold. Jordan, honor roll kid, part-time barista, the kind of boy who returned shopping carts without being asked, had promised his mom he'd be home by 11. Lena worked the evening shift at St. Mercy Hospital, charting vitals and translating medical jargon into calm. She was the person families looked at when they needed a straight answer. We'll take it one step at a time, she always told them. She believed it. She had to dock at 10:38 p.m. Jordan texted, leaving now. Ty needs a ride. 10 minutes. At 11:06, he didn't walk through the door. At 11:11, Lena checked the driveway. Empty. At 11:14, sirens tore down Maple Avenue toward Kenner's Hardware, the mom and pop store with a back alley that smelled like oil and summer rain. By 11:27, the town had a headline. Local man found dead behind hardware store. By 12:02, someone whispered the first rumor. They think it's the Hale boy. Here's the official story they liked. A fight behind the store, a panicked call that came too late, a text recovered from Jordan's phone that said, don't call yet. A hoodie with Jordan's school mascot found near a dumpster. A witness who said a tall kid with curly hair ran, and Jordan has curls. Tie up a bow, send it to court. Simple, but there are 3 problems even a tired mother could see. Problem 1, Jordan's actual phone was waterlogged from a spilled latte and sitting in a bowl of rice on Lena's kitchen counter at 10:41 p.m. She was the one who poured the rice. The police showed her clean screenshots anyway. Cloud backup, they said, like magic. Same phone, same account. But the timestamp on one image, if you squint, is off by 4 minutes and 32 seconds. Why? Problem 2, the Ridgemark. Camera across from Kenner's Hardware skipped exactly 2 minutes the night of the incident. 10:41 to 10:43, then recovered perfectly. Electrical glitch, the report claimed. Except the store's electrician, a man Lena had never met, told her in the cereal aisle that the system had a battery backup and doesn't just hiccup at random. 2 minutes. Enough time for a person in a red baseball cap to walk in or walk out without being noticed. Enough time to plant a hoodie. Problem 3. The first 911 call was logged at 10:44 p.m., but in Lena's photo of the dispatcher's handwritten notes the one from a clipboard she glimpsed for half a second while asking for directions. There's a penciled test call at 10:39 with the same alley listed, then scribbled over so hard the paper nearly ripped. Did someone dial, hang up, and then decide to wait? Who told them to? You'll hear about Officer Dwyer, the man with the lighthouse tattoo on his forearm, who swore under oath he didn't know Jordan personally. You'll learn why Lena kept replaying the moment he stood in her kitchen and touched that bowl of rice like he was measuring the grains. You'll meet Ty, the friend who needed a ride, who said he didn't see anything and then moved 2 towns over a week later. You'll see what happens to people who ask too many questions in a place where everyone's uncle knows a guy at the station. But first, picture this. A mother standing in a grocery store parking lot under buzzing lights, dialing a number written on a flyer community tip line because she thinks maybe the truth counts more if it comes from a stranger. Check the 2 missing minutes, she says, using a voice lower than her own, as if fear itself could be fooled. Back in Courtroom 2B, time unfreezes. The 4-person's lips shape a syllable Lena will never forget, whether it's the word she dreads or the one she still hopes for. Jordan doesn't look at the jury. He looks at his mother's hands ink-stained, steady, impossible, and nods once as if to say, "Mom, whatever happens, don't stop." And that's the rub, isn't it? How do you prove your child's innocence when the evidence has already been arranged to fit another story? How do you make 12 strangers care about the 2 minutes they can't see, the 4-minute timestamp drift they don't understand, the scribble that wasn't supposed to be photographed? If you were Lena, you'd start with what you have. A bowl of rice, a notebook, a town that wants silence, and a question that won't let you sleep. Who was wearing the red cap? Maple Ridge, Pennsylvania. Population just under 30,000. On the map, it was a dot surrounded by rolling farmland and back roads lined with weathered barns. But to the people who lived there, it was supposed to be a refuge, a place where porch lights were left on out of habit, not fear, and where neighbors nodded at each other while unloading groceries. A town that sold itself on safety, on predictability, on the illusion that nothing truly dark could survive here. And yet, in the summer of 2019, Maple Ridge would become the setting of a story that stripped away every one of those illusions. Lena Hall had built her life inside that illusion because she had no choice. She wasn't loud, she wasn't flashy. She was a nurse, a mother, and a widow who had been piecing together stability one shift, one paycheck, one sleepless night at a time. Her husband had died when their son Jordan was only 9, and since then Lena's existence had been defined by sacrifice. She drove an aging Honda that coughed to life on cold mornings. She clipped coupons. She patched jeans instead of buying new ones. But she never once let her son feel the weight of her exhaustion. If anything, she carried it with pride, as if endurance was the one luxury she could still afford. Lena's faith wasn't rooted in sermons or church pews. It was in people the stubborn belief that if you put enough honesty into the world, someone would notice. That if you told the truth often enough, it had to matter eventually. She never realized how fragile that faith really was, or how easily it could be shattered by 12 strangers in a courtroom. Her son, Jordan Halley, was 19. He had the restless energy of someone too big for a small town, but not yet big enough for the world outside it. He wasn't a star athlete or a straight-A genius, but he was steady, reliable. Friends called him the anchor, because when others flaked, he showed up. When others laughed at someone different, he spoke up. He worked weekends at Bean Street Coffee, saving every tip in a jar he had labeled Dream Fund. His dream was art school in Philadelphia. His passion was photography, not the curated kind. That lived and died on social media, but raw images. The sheen of rain on blacktop, rusting bridges at sunset, the lines on his mother's hands when she thought no one was looking. Beauty hides where people don't look, he once told Lena. Most people see puddles. I see mirrors. Lena held on to that sentence. It sounded like hope. It sounded like the proof that all her sacrifices meant something. Maple Ridge was, on the surface, the perfect backdrop for a boy like Jordan. But beneath that surface lay cracks no one wanted to talk about. The police department had been accused more than once of cutting corners, even planting evidence. Cases had vanished quietly. Lawsuits had been settled under the table. But the town was addicted to its own reputation for safety, and so most people looked away. As long as the lawns were green and the high school football team kept winning, no one wanted to believe that justice here could be bent or broken. The courthouse, with its chipped stone steps and creaking doors, stood as a monument to small-town tradition. The Kenner family owned the hardware store downtown, sponsoring Little League teams and donating paint to school musicals. Everyone knew the Kenners. Everyone trusted them. And so when tragedy struck behind their store, it wasn't just a crime. Seen, it was a betrayal of the town's identity. And Maple Ridge, like every small town, needed a quick answer. A culprit. A face to blame. Justice had to feel swift, even if it wasn't right. The last Friday of the school year was buzzing with a different kind of electricity. Seniors were chasing one last night of freedom before graduation scattered them. There were bonfires out. On Miller's farm, kegs smuggled into basements, music blaring from old cars parked by the river. Jordan wasn't the party type. He preferred the quiet hum of his guitar strings or the click of his camera shutter. But that night, his best friend Ty begged him for a ride. "Come on, man. Just an hour. I need a lift home anyway." Lena wasn't. Thrilled. She had a shift at St. Mercy Hospital that night, 12 hours on her feet, and she wanted the reassurance that Jordan would be home safe when she returned. "Back by 11, she warned, pointing her finger as if her words could. "Pin him to the clock." "I'll set an alarm," Jordan said, waving his cracked phone with a grin. "You know me, Mom. Human boomerang." She raised an eyebrow. "Boomerangs don't always come back." "Then I'll prove I'm the exception." He kissed her cheek and jogged out the door. That was the last time she saw him free, not at St. Mercy. The night unfolded like any other. An older man with chest pains, a child with a broken arm, the endless rhythm of machines beeping and monitors flashing. Lena charted vitals, adjusted 4 drips, whispered reassurances to families who needed to believe their loved ones were safe. At 10:38, her phone buzzed with a text from Jordan. "Leaving now. Ty needs a ride." 10 minutes. Relief flooded her. He was responsible, predictable, safe. But then the minutes stretched, and the world began to tilt at 11:06. She glanced at the wall clock near the nurse's station. Jordan should have been home. By 11:14, she was in her driveway, staring at the empty space where his car should have been. At 11:20, sirens screamed down Maple Avenue, their red-blue glow painting the hospital windows in colors that felt like a warning. By 11:27, the whispers had begun. "There's been an incident. Someone's dead." By midnight, the rumor had a name. By 1 a.m., officers were knocking on her door. Jordan was sitting in the living room when they arrived, his hair damp from the rain, his eyes wide and dazed. "Mom, I swear, I don't know what they're talking about. I wasn't there." "I didn't." But the officers didn't want explanations. They wanted a confession. They wanted a name to feed the town's hunger for closure. They put him in handcuffs right there in the living room, in front of the coffee table still littered. with his half-finished sketches and the notebook where he'd written down ideas for his art portfolio. Lena shouted, demanded answers, but the only response was the heavy sound of the door closing behind them. Her son was 19. He had never been in trouble before. And now, in the eyes of Maple Ridge, he was already guilty. That night, Lena realized the truth she would spend years proving. It's not enough to be innocent. You have to fight for innocence. And sometimes, the fight is one you have to wage alone. The night of June 7th was supposed to be ordinary in Maple Ridge, Pennsylvania. Summer had just begun to wrap its humid fingers around the town, and high school seniors were buzzing with the last taste of freedom before graduation. Porch lights burned like constellations along Maple Avenue, and the familiar hum of cicadas filled the air. To most of the town, it was just another Friday night. To the Hawley family, it was the beginning of a storm that would never end. Behind Kenner's Hardware, a narrow alley stretched between the store and the old warehouse. It was the kind of place kids avoided unless they wanted trouble lined with dumpsters, slick with oil stains, and shadowed by the glow of a single failing street lamp. At 10:44 p.m., that alley became a crime scene. The call to dispatch came. In sharp and panicked, a man down blood, possible homicide. When Officer Dwyer arrived, his cruiser's lights washed the brick walls in stuttering red and blue. By the time the ambulance arrived, the victim was already gone, the man lying face. Down on the cold pavement was Tommy Reeves, 43 years old. He was a part-time worker at Kenner's Hardware, known in town for his bad temper, his drinking, and his revolving door employment history. People didn't like him, but no one had expected him to end up like this. Skull fractured, blood pooling, in a widening halo beneath his head. The report would later claim he had been struck with a blunt object. No weapon was recovered that night, but in Maple Ridge, speculation was quicker than evidence. Within hours, a rumor was already spreading. Someone had seen a young man fleeing the alley, tall and slender with curly hair. To most of Maple Ridge, that description fit only one name, Jordan Hall Dot. The police found what they would later call their smoking gun, just feet from the body. Behind a dumpster, partially hidden under a stack of broken-down boxes, was a navy blue hoodie with the Maple Ridge High mascot stitched across the chest. It was smeared with blood along the sleeve. Everyone in town had seen Jordan wear that hoodie. He wore it to class, to football games, in yearbook photos, even in a framed picture still hanging on the Hawley family's fridge. To the police, it was undeniable. Jordan had been there. Jordan had fought with Reeves. Jordan had left the scene, but Lena knew the truth. She had folded that same hoodie on top of Jordan's dresser 3 days earlier after scrubbing out a coffee. Stain on the cuff. She remembered it clearly because she had muttered about how her son should take better care of his clothes. How could that hoodie have traveled from the dresser to the alley without anyone noticing? The question would gnaw at her for years, but on that night, her protests were drowned out by the sound of evidence bags sealing shut. Then came the phone. According to investigators, Jordan had sent a text at 10:39 p.m. just minutes before, the estimated time of the attack. The message read, "Don't call yet, wait." To the prosecution, this was damning. It suggested coordination, premeditation, a plan. But Lena stared at them in disbelief when they presented the screenshots. Jordan's phone had been broken all week. He had spilled an iced latte over it at Bean Street Coffee, frying the circuits. She had been the one to dump it into a bowl of rice on the kitchen counter, hoping it might recover. It hadn't turned on since. How could messages keep appearing? From a phone that wasn't even working? The explanation from police was thin. Something about cloud backups. Something about synced devices. Technical jargon that left Lena cold. None of it made sense. But the truth didn't matter as much as the perception. A text was a text, and in the narrative being built, it was enough that the Ridgemart security camera should have cleared everything. Up, its lens pointed directly toward the back entrance of Kenner's Hardware. If anyone had gone in or out, it should have captured it. And it did, except for 2 critical minutes. At 10:41 p.m., the feed cut out. At 10:43, it returned as if nothing had happened. The police called it an electrical glitch, nothing to see here. But Lena would later track down the store's electrician, a grizzled man with grease-stained hands, who shook his head when she asked. "Those systems have a backup battery," he said quietly. "They don't just go dark. Not unless someone wants them to." 2 minutes. That was all it took. Long enough for a figure in a red baseball cap to step into the alley. Long enough to drop a hoodie that didn't belong there. Long enough to swing something heavy and disappear into the night. Those missing minutes were the heart of the mystery, but in court they were brushed aside as coincidence, as malfunction. And then there was the witness. A college freshman named Troy Barker stepped forward, claiming he had been walking home from a party when he saw a young man with curly hair sprinting away from the alley. He didn't give a name at first. Under pressure, he admitted that the figure looked like Jordan. That single word "looked" was enough to be written into the report, enough to lodge itself into the jury's memory months later. What Lena noticed, however, was the inconsistency. In one statement, Troy said the runner wore jeans. In another, dark sweatpants. He said he saw the man's height, but not his face. He admitted he had been drinking. None of that seemed to matter to the investigators, who seized on his testimony as if it were gospel dot by midnight. The case against Jordan was already being assembled. A hoodie, a phone message, a shaky eyewitness. To the police, it was enough. To the town, it was more than enough. Maple Ridge needed a culprit, and Jordan Hawley fit the shape of one perfectly dot at 1 a.m. The knock came at the Hawley home. Lena opened the door to find officers standing on her porch, their expressions already hardened, already convinced. Jordan was sitting in the living room, hair damp from the rain, sketchbook still open on the coffee table. He looked up in confusion as the officers stepped inside. "Mom?" he said, his voice small, uncertain. They didn't wait for explanations. They read him his rights in a monotone rhythm, cold and rehearsed. They clicked handcuffs around his wrists. Lena shouted, demanded to know what was happening, begged them to listen. He didn't do this. He was with his friend. He just got home. But the words fell into silence. In the eyes of Maple Ridge, Jordan Hawley wasn't a boy anymore. He was a suspect. The neighbors' curtains twitched as the cruiser pulled away, carrying him into the night. By morning, whispers would spread faster than facts. By sunrise, the town had already decided the Hawley boy was guilty. For Lena, that was the moment her world broke. But it was also the moment she decided she would not stop. She would not let silence convict her son. She would fight, even if the fight consumed every breath she had left. Because what the system didn't count on was the stubborn strength of a mother who had already lost once and refused to lose again. And somewhere in the shadows of Maple Ridge, someone else knew the truth. Someone who had walked through those missing 2 minutes. Someone who had left behind a smear of blood, a hoodie, and a trail of lies that the real story hadn't even begun. The Maple Ridge Police Department was not a grand building. It was a squat brick square that looked more like a post office than the keeper of justice. But inside it held the power to decide who in town was safe and who was damned. On June 7th, just after midnight, those walls swallowed Jordan Hawley whole. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the lights buzzing overhead. To most people, it was routine, but to Lena Hall, walking through the doors in her damp hospital scrubs, It felt like crossing into enemy territory. She carried her spiral notebook tucked under her arm like armor, though deep down she knew paper and ink were fragile. Weapons against the machine, she was about to face Dot in a small holding room. Jordan sat at a steel table, wrists cuffed, curls, damp with sweat and rain. He had never been in trouble before, never even had a speeding ticket. Now he stared at two detectives who looked at him not as a boy, but as a suspect, a case, a box to check. Detective Monroe, older and heavyset, leaned forward with the calm authority of a man who believed his own instincts were fact. You were seen running from the alley, Jordan. A man is dead. His blood is on your hoodie. We can make this easier if you just tell us what happened. His partner, Detective Ruiz, younger, sharper, with a smirk that made everything sound like a trap, crossed his arms. Jordan shook his head, his voice cracking but firm. I wasn't there. That's not my hoodie. I was driving Ty home. Ask him. He knows. Ruiz's smile widened like he'd been waiting for that line. We already did. Your friend said you dropped him off, then left again. He doesn't know where you went. Convenient, huh? Jordan's heart sank. Ty, drunk and unreliable, had managed to leave him exposed, vulnerable. That's not true, he insisted, louder now. I went straight home. My mom was waiting. Ask her. Monroe's eyes narrowed, as if he had heard that excuse 100 times before. We will, but mothers say what mothers say, you understand? They'll protect their kids, even when they know the truth. The tactic was obvious. Isolate him, make him doubt his only ally. Jordan dropped his gaze to the cold metal table. His chest rose and fell too quickly. He had grown up believing innocence was enough. In that moment, he felt that belief shatter Dot at 3:15 a.m. Lena sat in the lobby, clutching her notebook. Her shoes squeaked from the rain, her eyes burning with disbelief. She had raised Jordan to believe in fairness, in telling the truth, in trusting the system. But the officer at the desk looked at her as if she were an obstacle. When she demanded to see her son, he replied without even meeting her eyes. He's being questioned. You'll have to wait. She reminded him that Jordan was 19, terrified, alone, that he needed a lawyer. The officer gave her a thin smile. Innocent kids don't need lawyers. It was the first time Lena felt the invisible wall between her and the people sworn to protect her got by dawn. The case file was already filling. Exhibit A, the navy hoodie pulled from behind the dumpster, bagged and tagged with a blood smear. Exhibit B, the Ridgemart surveillance footage, neatly labeled, with a 2-minute blackout at 10:41 written off as a technical error. Exhibit C, the witness statement from Troy Barker, drunk and inconsistent, but nonetheless typed up as credible. Exhibit D, the text message, don't call yet. Wait, printed in bold, highlighted in yellow. Every page was another nail in Jordan's coffin. The fact that the hoodie had been at home on his dresser days earlier, that the phone was waterlogged in rice on the kitchen counter, that the witness contradicted himself, none of it mattered. Cases weren't about holes. They were about stories. And Detective Ruiz was already writing his. Jordan confronted Tommy Reeves in the alley. An argument sparked, tempers flared, Reeves fell. Jordan panicked and ran. He left the hoodie. He sent a text to stall help. Neat, simple. SELLABL at 6 a.m. After hours under fluorescent lights, Monroe slid a piece of paper across the table. Just sign this, Jordan. Say you were there, but it was an accident. You didn't mean to. Kill him. You'll get leniency. Maybe probation, maybe less. But if you keep lying, the day will bury you. You'll spend your life in prison. Jordan stared at the paper, hands trembling, his chest heaving. He thought of his mother outside, thought of art school, thought of everything he wanted. He pushed the paper back. "I didn't do it. I won't sign." Ruiz leaned back, smirking. "Then God help you, kid." By mid-morning, news vans were parked outside the station. Headlines spread. "Young man arrested in Maple Ridge homicide." Cameras flashed. Neighbors peeked through curtains. On social media, judgment was swift. I always knew that Holly boy was trouble. Didn't his dad have issues? Runs in the family. None of it was true, but in Maple Ridge, perception was evidence. When Lena was finally allowed to see her son, she found him pale, hollow-eyed, cuffed to a bench. She knelt, gripping his hands, her voice low and fierce. "Baby, listen to me. You are not alone. I don't care what they say. I will fight this. I will not let them take you." Jordan's tears fell freely now. "They don't believe me, Mom. Nobody does." She pressed her forehead against his. "I do. And that's enough. Hold on. We'll get a lawyer. We'll find the truth. I promise." But even as she spoke, she felt the weight of doubt pressing in. Promises meant little against a system built to convict. The final shock came that afternoon, when the district attorney stood on the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, officers behind him like a wall. He announced the charge, second-degree murder. He praised the police for their swift and thorough work. He called Jordan a dangerous young man who committed a senseless act of violence. He promised the community closure. Lena stood. In the crowd, notebook clutched like a shield, her heart racing. She wanted to scream, to demand someone notice the missing minutes, the broken phone, the scribbled dispatcher log. But the cameras weren't aimed at her. They were aimed at the man selling certainty. That night, back in her kitchen, Lena opened her notebook to a blank page. Her hands shook as she wrote a single sentence: "Find the red cap." She didn't yet know whose it was. She didn't yet know how to prove it mattered. But in her bones, she understood it was the thread that could unravel the lie strangling her son. And from that moment forward, she was no longer just a nurse, no longer just a grieving mother. She was an investigator, an advocate, a fighter. The system had cast her son as the villain. She would dedicate every breath she had left to proving them wrong. The investigation had begun, and so had Lena's war. The courthouse of Maple Ridge stood like a relic, its limestone facade weathered by decades of storms, its clock tower frozen 5 minutes behind the truth. On the morning of Jordan Hale's first hearing, the steps leading up to those creaking doors became a stage. News vans lined the curb, satellite dishes angled skyward, microphones waiting for sound bites. Curious townsfolk gathered as if it were a parade, whispering judgments before a single piece of evidence had been debated in front of a jury. For Maple Ridge, this wasn't just a case. It was theatered out inside. The corridors smelled of varnish and dust. The portraits of stern-faced judges glared down at everyone who passed. Lena walked through those hallways with her notebook pressed to her chest, her shoulders squared though her stomach churned. She had chosen her clothes carefully simple, dark, respectful. She wanted the jury, the reporters, anyone watching, to see not just a desperate mother, but a woman of dignity. Her son's freedom depended on perception as much as fact. Jordan shuffled beside her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, dressed in an orange jumpsuit that made him look more like a stranger than her boy. His curls hung limp, his face pale, his eyes wide with a fear he tried to hide. Lena whispered to him as the bailiff guided them toward the courtroom doors. "Don't look at them, baby. Look at me. You hold your head up. You're innocent, and we will prove it." The doors swung open, and the world devoured him. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the benches. Neighbors leaned forward, craning to see. The prosecution sat tall and polished, their files stacked neatly, their suits pressed. The district attorney himself had taken the case ambition gleaming in his eyes. He wanted a conviction that would cement his reputation as the man who brought swift justice to Maple Ridge. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced, and Judge Halvorsen entered. He was a broad man with a heavy brow and a voice that carried like thunder. We are here to hear the case of the Commonwealth versus Jordan Hawley, charged with second-degree murder. Lena's heart pounded so hard, she thought it might echo in the chamber. She squeezed her notebook, fighting the urge to leap to her feet and shout her son's innocence. Instead, she forced herself to sit, to breathe, to watch. This was the system's game, and if she wanted to win, she had to learn its rules. The prosecution's story, the district attorney rose for his opening remarks. His voice was steady, practiced, designed for sound bites. He painted a picture of Jordan as a hot-headed young man who clashed with Tommy Reeves behind the hardware store. He described the hoodie with blood on the sleeve. He spoke of the text, "Don't call yet, wait," as if it were a smoking gun. He pointed to the witness who claimed to have seen a curly-haired figure fleeing the scene. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he concluded, "this case is not complicated. It is not mysterious. The defendant's actions were deliberate. His flight was telling, and his guilt is clear. The Commonwealth will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Jordan Hawley is responsible for the death of Tommy Reeves." The jury nodded along, some scribbling notes, some glancing briefly at Jordan with expressions that already leaned toward suspicion. The defense falters Jordan's public defender rose next. He was underpaid, overworked, and unprepared. His suit was wrinkled, his voice hesitant. He spoke about Jordan's clean record, his character, his dreams of art school. He mentioned that Jordan had been at a party, that he had friends who could vouch for him. But his words lacked fire. He did not mention the hoodie folded on the dresser. He did not question the broken phone sitting in rice on Lena's counter. He did not push the missing 2 minutes of footage. He offered sympathy but not strategy, a whisper against the DA's booming voice. Lena's stomach twisted. She gripped her notebook harder. If this man couldn't fight, she would. The first witness the prosecution called Officer Dwyer. He described finding the body, the hoodie, the scene. He spoke with certainty, as if every detail had been branded into truth. When asked if he believed the hoodie belonged to Jordan, he nodded firmly. "I had seen the defendant wear it multiple times around town. There was no doubt in my mind." The defense attorney barely pressed him. A few half-hearted questions about procedure, about timing. Nothing that pierced the certainty of his testimony. Lena wanted to scream. Ask him about the rice bowl. Ask him why he touched it, like he was checking something. Ask him why he avoided mentioning the red cap. But her voice had no place here. Next came Troy Barker, the college freshman. He admitted he had been walking home from a party, that he saw someone run. He described a tall kid with curly hair. The DA smiled as Troy said, "It looked like Jordan." The words landed heavy, sinking into the jury's minds. The defense cross-examined weakly. "You'd been drinking, correct?" "Yes." "And it was dark?" "Yes." "And you didn't see the runner's face?" "No, but thank you. No further questions." It was over too quickly. The damage was done. Lena's boiling resolve. By the end of the day, the jury had been given a story-clean, neat damning. Lena walked out of the courthouse with Jordan's chain-clad steps echoing behind her. Her notebook pressed so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She could hear the whispers of the crowd. "That poor mother. What a shame. He looked guilty to me, Dot." She refused to let their voices sink in. Instead, she opened her notebook that night at the kitchen table and began to write, line after line. Every inconsistency, every missing piece, every question that had gone unasked. The hoodie, the phone, the missing minutes, the red cap. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't a detective. But she was a mother, And sometimes a mother's love is sharper than any cross-examination. The fight begins. Lena spent the following days knocking on doors. She visited the Ridgemart electrician, pressing him until he admitted again that the camera blackout wasn't normal. She tracked down Ty, Jordan's so-called friend, demanding he tell her the truth about that night. She even called the dispatcher's office, asking about the scribbled note she had glimpsed on the clipboard. The call logged at 10:39, then erased. Most doors slammed in her face. Some offered half answers, some whispered warnings. But Lena refused to stop. At night, she returned to the courthouse to sit in the gallery, to take notes on every detail, every gesture, every phrase the prosecution twisted. She knew the jury only heard what was presented, but she also knew truth lived in the cracks. If no one else would dig into those cracks, she would. The first trial wasn't about winning. It was about survival. It was about Lena learning the shape of the battlefield, about realizing that her son's life depended not just on facts, but on the will to drag those facts into the light. The prosecution thought they were dealing with a scared, grieving mother. What they didn't realize was that grief had transformed into fire dot as she walked out of the courthouse after the first week of testimony. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust into her face. "Do you have anything to say about your son?" one asked. Lena met the camera with eyes steady and fierce. "Yes," she said. "My son is innocent, and I will prove it, even if I have to take down this entire system to do it." The crowd gasped, the reporters scribbled, and for the first time, the day frowned. Lena Halle had declared war. The courtroom emptied each day like a theater after a play. The jury filed out. The attorneys packed their briefcases. The judge vanished behind chambers. But when the doors closed and the crowd went home, the story didn't end for Lena Halle. For her, the real battle began in the shadows of Maple Ridge, on quiet streets, in hushed conversations, in the places the system refused to look. She was no longer just Jordan's mother. She had become his only investigator. Lena had never studied law. She didn't know the language of motions or objections. But she understood people. She knew how to listen, how to notice the detail others ignored, how to press gently until truth cracked through. And she had one tool sharper than any lawyer's tongue: a spiral notebook filled with dates, questions, fragments, and names. That notebook became her weapon, her shield, her map. Knocking on doors, her first stop was Ridgemart, the convenience store across from Kenner's Hardware. The store manager, a balding man named Carl Jennings, was reluctant to talk. "I've said all I know to the police," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably behind the counter. But Lena pressed him. She reminded him she had bought groceries there for years, that her son had carried her bags more times than she could count. "Please," she whispered, "you know Jordan. He's not a killer." "Those missing minutes, what happened to your cameras?" Carl hesitated, then leaned closer. "The police told me not to say a word, said it was a glitch. But I've run that system 10 years. It doesn't glitch like that. The footage was fine when I checked earlier that day. When I logged in the next morning, those 2 minutes were gone. Just gone, like someone erased them." His eyes darted to the security monitor above his head. "You didn't hear it from me." Lena scribbled furiously in her notebook. 10:41 to 10:43. Footage erased, not glitch. Police ordered silence. She thanked him and walked out with her heart pounding. She had confirmation, but no one in court would listen unless she could prove it on paper. Ty's betrayal, her next stop was Ty Collins, Jordan's best friend, or the boy she thought was his best friend. Ty lived 2 towns over now, having moved. Almost immediately after the arrest, his mother answered the door first, eyes wary. "We already told the police everything." "I'm not the police," Lena said softly. "I'm Jordan's mother." Ty eventually appeared, hair unkempt, guilt etched across his face. "I didn't mean to screw him," he blurted before she even asked. They kept asking me what happened, and I couldn't remember. I'd been drinking, you know." I told them I wasn't sure, but they wrote it like I said he left again. "Ty," Lena said, voice trembling, "you know my son. You know he drove you home, then went home himself. You know he didn't hurt anyone." He looked away, shame pulling at his features. "I know, but once they wrote it down, I was scared to change it. They told me if I lied, I could be charged too." Lena felt both fury and pity. She wanted to scream, but instead she wrote, "Ty pressured by police, statement twisted." She knew confronting him wouldn't undo the damage, but at least now she had another piece of the puzzle. Her son's so-called alibi had been manipulated into silence. The dispatcher's log, the image of the dispatcher's clipboard, haunted her. She had seen it for just a second that night, a scribbled note of a call at 10:39 p.m., then erased so hard the paper nearly ripped. Official reports listed. The first call at 10:44. 5 missing minutes. Why? She drove to the dispatcher's office, her palms sweating as she approached the front desk. "I just need to check something," she said, voice steady. That night, June 7th, was there a test call logged before 10:44? The receptionist stiffened. "I'm not authorized to share those records." "I don't need a copy," Lena pressed. "Just yes or no, please. My son's life depends on it." The woman's eyes flickered with something: fear, sympathy, both. She leaned in and whispered, "There was a call, but it never made the official log. That's all I can say." Then she stood, ending the conversation. Lena wrote, 10:39 call existed. Erased from log. Dispatcher scared. Another hole. Another. Thread. The red cap. Every night, Lena returned to her kitchen table, spreading her notes across the wood like a detective pinning strings on a corkboard. And every night her eyes came back to the same phrase written in bold letters. Find the red cap. It had been there in the background of a photo. She wasn't supposed to have a blurry image, snapped by a bystander's phone as the ambulance lights reflected off the alley. Amid the chaos, amid the officers, there was a figure half turned away, wearing a red baseball cap with a broken brim. No one mentioned him in the reports. No one asked who he was. He was a ghost in the evidence, yet Lena's gut screamed that he mattered. She began asking around town. Did anyone see a man in a red cap that night? Most shook their heads. Some said no too quickly. One older woman at the laundromat muttered, "Red cap? Don't ask about him. You'll only bring trouble." Trouble. The word hung heavy in Lena's chest. Trouble meant fear. Fear meant truth. She underlined it 3 times. Red cap equals key. The system closes ranks. As Lena pushed deeper, she noticed something chilling. People were afraid to talk. Witnesses who once grumbled about police misconduct now shut their doors. Workers at Kenner's Hardware avoided her eyes. Even friends she had known for years crossed the street to avoid her. The system was closing. Ranks, and anyone who helped her risked being dragged down with her. One evening, as she walked back to her car after questioning a former co-worker of Tommy Reeves, she found a note under her windshield wiper. It was a scrap of paper, scrawled in uneven handwriting. "Stop digging or you'll regret it." Her hands shook, but she pocketed the note. Fear coursed through her, but she reminded herself of Jordan sitting in a cell, waiting. If they were warning her, it meant she was close to something. A mother's transformation days turned into weeks. Court hearings dragged on, each one leaning heavier against Jordan. But outside those walls, Lena transformed. She was no longer the quiet nurse who worked double shifts without complaint. She became relentless. She mapped timelines, tracked inconsistencies, collected whispers. She learned to read reports, to question procedure, to spot the holes dotted night. She looked at her reflection in the kitchen window and barely recognized herself. Dark circles under her eyes, ink stains on her fingers, a fire in her gaze. "You're not just his mother anymore," she whispered to herself. "You're his defense." The prosecution thought the case was airtight. The town thought it was over. But Lena knew better. She had seen the cracks, the missing minutes, the erased call, the twisted testimony, the man in the red cap. And she would not stop until she pried those cracks open wide enough to shatter the entire lie. Because if the system wanted war, Lena Hawley was ready. The night had fallen heavy over the city, pressing down with a suffocating stillness that made every sound feel amplified, every shadow longer than it should have been. Lena Hawley walked briskly, her coat pulled tightly around her, though the chill that ran down her spine had little to do with the wind. She couldn't shake the image burned into her memory. A man, a fleeting figure, the crimson baseball cap pulled low over his brow on the night her son was arrested. It wasn't much, just a flash of color in a crowd, but in her gut, she knew that man had seen something, maybe even done something. The problem was, he wasn't in the police reports, wasn't in the witness lists, wasn't even mentioned in the courtroom. He was a ghost, erased before he had ever been acknowledged. And ghosts, she was learning, were often the most dangerous. People to chase Dot in the days after her discovery of the cap in that old photograph. Lena started digging where no one else dared. She pressed her contacts at the local library archives, pored over old arrest logs, and whispered questions to anyone who might have once crossed paths with a man named Ray. That was the name she had picked up like a scrap from the floor of a ruined house. People didn't say much when she mentioned it, but the reaction was always the same. Eyes darting, lips tightening, a silence that screamed louder than words. One elderly bartender, a man with trembling hands and eyes, dulled by. Age muttered that Ray was trouble you don't look for. A former factory worker swore he remembered the man, always in that same red cap, always lurking at the edges of fights. The kind of guy who stirred chaos, but somehow never got caught. Lena felt herself circling something foul, something that stank of corruption. She found small newspaper blurbs buried decades deep. Ray involved in a late-night brawl. Ray suspected in a petty theft. Ray questioned in connection with a stabbing. But none of them had endings. Every article cut short, every case dropped. Due to insufficient evidence. It was as if the man had an invisible shield. She didn't need to guess what that shield was made of. She had seen it working against her son, too. Connections, influence, power that seeped into the cracks of the justice system like mold. Meanwhile, Jordan's trial pressed forward like a machine on tracks, unstoppable, uncaring of the truth. The prosecutor was relentless, weaving narratives out of thin air, connecting dots that didn't exist. And the judge, who should have been a guardian of fairness, swatted down the defense's objections as if they were gnats buzzing in the heat. Lena sat in the gallery each day, watching her son sit there in that scratchy jumpsuit, chains around his wrists, his eyes dulled with fear. Every time their gazes met, Lena felt her chest tighten. She wanted to run to him, to shield him, too. Shout to the courtroom that they were all wrong. Instead, she could only sit silent while the gavel banged like a drum sealing his fate. One night, exhausted and broken, she dragged herself back to her car only to stop dead. There on her driver's seat lay a red cap. Her pulse spiked, her breath catching as her hands trembled toward it. The fabric was worn, sweat-stained, unmistakable. She hesitated before picking it up. Inside the brim was a folded scrap of paper. With trembling fingers she opened it, and her eyes narrowed at the words scrawled in dark ink. Stop digging. Last warning. Her first instinct was to drop it, to flee, to abandon this path before it consumed her. But almost instantly, another instinct roared louder, the instinct of a mother who had nothing left to lose. They were watching her. That meant she was close. That meant Ray was real, and he was afraid. And if he was afraid, then he had something to hide. She shoved the note into her bag, gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, and whispered to herself, "Not a chance." From that moment on, Lena knew the game had changed. She was no longer just searching for clues. She was being hunted. Her phone clicked sometimes when she lifted it. Her emails vanished without explanation, and twice she noticed the same black sedan in her rearview mirror. Still, she pressed forward. She visited the neighborhoods Ray used to haunt, small bars with flickering neon signs, greasy diners where the air smelled of burnt coffee. The stories were always the same. Ray was mean. Ray was reckless, but Ray never seemed to pay for it. "He's got friends," one man finally muttered, leaning so close his whiskey breath made her stomach turn. "Friends in places you don't want to poke at, lady." Every warning only fueled her more. She began compiling her own file, photocopies of those buried articles, statements scribbled in her notebook from reluctant witnesses, sketches of timelines where Ray's presence overlapped with other crimes. And then she found the thread that made her blood run cold. A half-forgotten police report from years earlier listed a Ray M., questioned after a violent altercation in a warehouse. The officer who filed it, the same detective who had led the charge against her son. The report had been marked misfiled and buried. When Lena tried to request the full document, she was told it no longer existed. But she knew. She knew the rot went deeper than she'd feared. As weeks passed, Jordan grew thinner, his letters to her more desperate. He begged her to stop, to let it go, to not put herself in danger. But Lena couldn't. A mother's love doesn't bend under threat. It hardens. She began tailing rumors of Ray herself, alone, late at night. More than once she thought she saw him, a shadow slipping into an alley, a man ducking into a car. Once she swore she saw the glint of his eyes under the brim of that cursed red cap, watching her from across the street. By the time she turned, he was gone. Then came the night she almost broke. She was driving home when her headlights caught something in the road. She slammed the brakes, heart pounding. Lying across the asphalt was a dead crow, its wings spread wide. On its neck was tied a strip of red fabric. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't random. This was a message. Go any further, and we'll make sure you end up like this bird. Lena pulled over, tears burning her eyes, hands shaking against the steering wheel. For a long moment she sat there, listening to the rain tap against the glass, wondering if she was truly strong enough to keep going. She thought of Jordan, alone in that cell, staring at the same walls, counting the same hours. She thought of his voice, breaking when he swore he hadn't done it. She thought of his life, his future, being buried alive under lies. And then she started the engine. Fear was real, but so was love. And love, she decided, was stronger. From that night forward, Lena became relentless. She traced every lead, no matter how thin, confronting people who flinched at the mention of Ray. Some doors slammed in her face, others opened to reveal trembling confessions. She pieced together fragments. Ray had been there the night of the crime. He'd been drinking heavily. He'd gotten into a fight near the alley where the murder happened. And then he vanished, disappearing like smoke. Yet always, just at the edge of her reach, there was a sense of him still watching. The deeper she went, the more she realized that Ray wasn't just a piece of the puzzle. He might be the entire missing link. If she could find him, if she could force the truth out of him, maybe she could save her son. But with every step forward, the shadows grew darker. the threats sharper. She began to understand that this wasn't just about Jordan anymore. This was about something bigger, something poisonous that pulsed through the city's veins. And by chasing it, she was putting herself in the crosshairs. Still, she whispered into the night as she pored over her notes, her eyes burning from lack of sleep. You wanted me to stop, but I'm just getting started. The city was waking up, but for Lena Halle, it felt like the day never ended. Sleep had become a stranger to her, stolen by the endless chase for a truth buried under threats and lies. Her kitchen table was covered with stacks of papers, photographs, scribbled notes that stretched across weeks of obsessive searching. Coffee cups stood half-empty beside folders that were stuffed with leads, most of them dead ends, but some carrying the faint glimmer of revelation. She had reached a point where her life had been reduced to two things: her son locked away in a cell, and the man in the red cap who seemed to hold the key to everything. As she rubbed her temples, exhaustion threatening to overtake her, she thought again about the warnings. The crow, the note, the eyes in the shadows. They wanted her afraid, silenced, broken. But every time she felt herself crumbling, she remembered Jordan's face behind that glass wall at the jail. His hands pressed against the divider, his voice shaking as he begged her not to give up. She couldn't. She wouldn't. That morning she received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. When she hesitated to answer, the voice that came through made her blood run cold. It was low, raspy, distorted. You think you're close, but you don't know how deep this goes. Turn back before you're buried. The line went dead before she could respond. For a moment, she just stood there, the phone trembling in her hand. She had expected threats, but hearing them spoken aloud made it real in a way paper never could. She sank into her chair, but only for a second. Then anger sparked, hot and consuming. They were watching her. They were afraid of her persistence. And that meant she was cutting close to the bone. She decided to change tactics. Rather than chasing shadows, she went straight to the heart of the institution that had failed her, the courthouse. Using a flimsy excuse about reviewing public records, she spent hours combing through old case files. The clerks were helpful at first, but their politeness curdled into suspicion when she started asking too many questions about cases tied to Detective Holbrook, the man who had led the investigation against Jordan. She noticed the pattern reports, missing pages, cases that mysteriously fell apart, suspects who vanished off the record. And threading through many of those files was the name she dreaded and desired most: Ray. Sometimes he was a witness, sometimes just a name mentioned in the margins, and sometimes the file would abruptly end right after his involvement. It was like watching a magician's trick, the way evidence evaporated whenever Ray was close. That night, Lena sat in her car outside the courthouse, staring at the building glowing under the street lamps. She clenched the wheel, her mind racing. She had the pieces, but she needed proof that couldn't be brushed aside. Something undeniable. She whispered to herself, if I can tie him to the night Jordan was arrested, if I can show he was there. Her thoughts were interrupted by movement in her rearview mirror. A car, the same black sedan she had noticed before. It idled across the street, lights off. Her pulse spiked. Without hesitation, she turned the key and pulled out, weaving through side streets, trying to lose them. The sedan followed, slow and deliberate. It was a message. We're here. We're watching. She drove until her hands shook from gripping the wheel, only breathing again when she lost sight of the car in the maze of the city's back roads. But the fear didn't last as long as the fury. If they were trailing her, it meant she was closer than ever. She pushed harder. The following days, she tracked down an old contact, an ex-cop named Delgado, forced out years ago under vague circumstances. He agreed to meet in a deserted diner. his eyes darting constantly to the door. When she asked him about Ray, Delgado's jaw tightened. "Lady, I should walk away right now. You don't understand who you're digging into." Lena leaned forward, her voice firm. "My son is going to rot in prison because of this man. You think I care about danger anymore?" For a long silence, Delgado studied her and then sighed. Ray wasn't just some thug. He was a runner for people high up, people with money, with pull. He got things done. Sometimes that meant silencing witnesses. Sometimes that meant making problems disappear. Holbrook covered for him more times than I can count. If Ray was anywhere near your boy's case, then your boy never stood a chance. The weight of his words sank into her chest like a stone. But Delgado wasn't. Finished. He slid a napkin across the table, scribbled with an address. Old warehouse. Dockside. He used to hole up there when things got hot. Don't know if he still does. But if you're crazy enough to keep looking, that's where I'd start. He stood quickly, tossing a few bills onto the counter, and muttered, "You didn't get this from me." Then he was gone. That night, Lena drove to the address, her headlights cutting through the fog rolling in from the bay. The warehouse stood like a hulking skeleton, its windows broken, its walls tagged with graffiti. She sat in her car, staring at it, every instinct screaming at her to leave. But she thought of Jordan, thought of his life being stolen, and forced herself forward. The air inside was damp and heavy, the silence broken only by the drip of water. Somewhere in the distance, she searched the rooms with her flashlight, her heart hammering in her ears. Most of the place was empty, just rot and dust. But in one back office, she found something that made her freeze. A table covered in scattered photographs. She picked one up and felt her stomach twist. It was Jordan, standing outside their home, unaware the photo was being taken. Another showed Lena herself, shopping in a grocery store. These weren't old. These were recent. The realization crashed over her. This wasn't just about her digging into Ray. He had been watching them long before she ever found his name. She staggered back, her flashlight beam trembling as it caught another object on the table, a folder, thick with papers. She opened it, flipping through pages of police reports, all with notes scribbled in the margins. One name repeated over and over, Holbrook. Underlined, circled, connected to dates and addresses. Her breath caught when she saw Jordan's name, written in angry strokes beside the words "easy target." Her vision blurred with rage. This was it. This was proof. They had chosen her son deliberately. She snapped photographs of everything with her phone, her fingers shaking. As she turned to leave, a sound froze her in place, the creak of a floorboard. She spun, flashlight cutting across the room, and caught a glimpse of movement. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, slipping into the shadows. The brim of a red cap glinted in the beam before he disappeared. Her throat tightened. He was here. He had been watching her the whole time. Panic surged as she bolted for the door, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. She reached her. Car slammed the locks down and tore out of the lot, breath ragged, heart slamming like a drum. She kept checking her mirrors, half expecting headlights to appear behind her, but the road stayed empty. When she finally pulled into her driveway, she collapsed against the steering wheel, tears streaming. She had seen him. She had been inches away from the man who had ruined everything. The next morning, Lena sat at her table again, staring at the photos she had taken of the files. They were damning, but would they be enough? The system that had protected Ray and Holbrook for so long wouldn't crumble easily. She knew she needed more, something irrefutable, something that couldn't be dismissed as circumstantial. But she also knew time was running out. Jordan's sentencing loomed, and once the gavel fell, clawing back his freedom would be nearly impossible. Her phone buzzed with a message. No number. Just one line. You should have listened. Her hands shook as she deleted it. The threats were constant now, circling her like wolves. But she refused to back down. Every warning, every shadow, every sleepless night only sharpened her resolve. She whispered into the silence of her home, as though speaking directly to the man in the red cap. You started this war, but I'll be the one to end it. Outside, the city hummed with life, unaware of the storm brewing in its veins. Lena knew the road ahead would only grow darker, but she was no longer afraid of the dark. The dark was where she would find him. And when she did, she would drag the truth into the light, no matter the cost. The courthouse clock struck 10, its chimes echoing across the marble halls, but Lena Hall barely noticed the sound. Her mind was a storm of fear and determination, every nerve on edge as she sat in the back row of the courtroom. Today was supposed to be a routine motion hearing for her son Jordan. Yet Lena had learned that nothing in this fight was routine. Every time she thought she had gathered enough evidence, enough courage, enough support, the system seemed to twist in on itself, crushing her hope. But not today. She clutched her folder tight against her chest, filled with the photos she had taken from the warehouse, the scribbled notes tying Detective Holbrook to Ray, and the surveillance shots of her family that still made her skin crawl. These weren't just scraps of paranoia anymore. They were tangible, undeniable. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As the judge entered, Lena's stomach flipped. She glanced at Jordan, seated at the defense table, his wrists chained, his eyes hollow from months in a cell. He looked up at her, and for the first time in weeks, she forced herself to smile. He needed to see her strength, even if she had none left to give. The prosecutor began droning about Jordan's supposed involvement in the robbery gone wrong, citing old witness statements and police reports. Lena's nails dug into the folder as she listened, each word like a knife. They spoke of her son as if he were a monster, ignoring the life he had lived, the kindness he had shown, the future that had been stolen. And then came Detective Holbrook, striding confidently to the witness stand, his uniform pristine, his demeanor smug. He painted Jordan as reckless, violent, a young man desperate for quick money. Lena wanted to scream, to leap from her seat and shove the photos in everyone's face, but she forced herself to stay still. Timing mattered. If she spoke too soon, she'd be thrown out, silenced again. She needed to wait for her chance. It came unexpectedly. The defense attorney, exhausted and overworked, asked Holbrook to clarify the chain of custody for a piece of evidence, a baseball cap allegedly found near the scene. Holbrook's hesitation was brief, but Lena caught it. His eyes flickered, his jaw clenched. The lawyer moved on, oblivious, but Lena's pulse spiked. That cap, red, Ray's cap, she knew it. She had seen it in the warehouse, in the shadows, when the man himself had nearly confronted her. How had it ended up in police evidence tied to Jordan? Her breathing quickened as pieces snapped together. Holbrook and Ray weren't just connected. They had orchestrated this. Evidence planted, narratives twisted, lives destroyed. And Jordan was just one of many dotted recess. Lena stepped into the hallway, her legs shaky. She dialed Delgado, the ex-cop who had risked so much by telling her the truth. When he answered, his voice was rough. "I told you to stop digging." Lena's words tumbled out in a rush. The cap. They used the cap, Ray's cap. Holbrook's on the stand right now, swearing it was Jordan's. "But I saw him, Delgado. I saw Ray wearing it. They planted it. Tell me I'm right." There was a long silence on the line. Then Delgado muttered, "Damn it. If you've got proof, you might just burn them down. But if you don't, if you slip, they'll bury you right alongside your son." Lena swallowed hard. She already knew that. "Then I won't slip," she whispered. more to herself than to him. That night, she spread every photo, every note, every scrap of evidence across her living room floor. She studied them like they were puzzle pieces, moving them, connecting them, drawing lines with red marker on large sheets of paper taped to the wall. Holbrook's name circled, Ray's name branching off it, the warehouse photos taped beside. Surveillance shots of Jordan. And in the center, the cap. She replayed the trial testimony in her mind again and again. Holbrook's smug tone, his certainty, his slight hesitation. The cap was the keystone. If she could prove it belonged to Ray, the whole structure would collapse. But how? She stared at the photos she had taken in the warehouse. One showed the cap resting on a table beside stacks of documents. Her heart pounded as she zoomed in on her phone. There, faint but visible, stitched initials on the inside band. R.M. Ray's full name was Raymond Maddox. The evidence wasn't just circumstantial, it was screaming the truth. Her hands trembled as she printed the photo. She wanted to storm back into court the next morning and throw it at the judge. But she also knew the system wouldn't make it that easy. She needed the chain of custody, a direct line proving that the cap found in evidence had been swapped, misfiled, or altered. Without that, they'd dismiss her as desperate, a grieving mother seeing ghosts. So she went back to the courthouse the next day, not for the hearing, but for the archives. Hours turned into a blur as she combed through logs, signatures, entries documenting the evidence. And then she found a page with Detective Holbrook's signature, authorizing the submission of the cap. But the date was wrong. Off by 2 weeks. Impossible, because by then the cap had already been logged by another officer in a different file. Her pulse quickened. A forgery. A sloppy attempt to cover tracks. Lena photocopied everything, tucking it into her folder. On her way out, she felt the prickling sensation again. That awful, suffocating feeling of being watched. She quickened her pace, but the footsteps behind her grew louder. She turned a corner, heart in her throat, and came face to face with a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, heavy-set, eyes cold. "You need to stop," he said flatly, blocking her path. She clutched her bag, forcing herself to stand tall. "I won't," she answered. For a terrifying second, she thought he would grab her, but instead he leaned closer and hissed, "Then pray your boy can survive the sentence, because you won't survive what comes next." And then he was gone, melting into the courthouse crowd. That night, Lena locked every door, checked every window twice. Her house felt less like a home and more like a trap. She sat by the front door with a baseball bat, unable to sleep, listening for every creak, every rustle outside. Yet beneath the fear, something fierce burned brighter than ever. They were escalating because she was winning. They knew the walls were closing in. She only needed to push harder, hold her nerve, and she could drag them all into the light. Next morning, Lena returned to court, folder clutched like a shield. As she stepped inside, she noticed a figure leaning against the far wall. Ray, the red cap low over his eyes. He shouldn't have been there, yet he was, smirking at her, daring her to falter. Her stomach twisted, but she didn't look away. She met his gaze with pure defiance, then turned and walked into the courtroom. Whatever it took, whatever danger awaited, she was ready. She had found her weapon, and now she would use it. The morning sky over Maple Ridge was colorless and thin, the kind of gray that made the courthouse look older and heavier than it already was. Lena Howe parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance because her hands were shaking too badly to keep driving. In her bag, between a thermos of coffee she'd forgotten to drink and her worn spiral notebook, sat the copies photographs of the warehouse table with the red cap, the stitched initials inside the band, the pages. That tied Detective Holbrook to evidence logged on the wrong date, The shots that proved someone had stalked her and Jordan for weeks before the murder. The papers rasped against one another when she breathed. Today wasn't supposed to be a verdict day. It was supposed to be a routine hearing on motions. The defense had barely had time to file. But after months of being dismissed, of being told to sit down and let the system do its job, she had decided the system would hear her whether it wanted to or not. Inside, the corridor felt colder, the fluorescent lights too bright for the faces that turned as she passed. Some eyes were curious, some hostile, some pitying. She kept her chin level, as if balancing a glass of water on it. When she slipped into the courtroom, Jordan was already seated at the defense table, chains at his wrists, orange cloth too large. For his frame, he looked back. For a heartbeat, the boy he had been flickered through the fear, the kid who took pictures of puddles because they looked like mirrors. She smiled because he needed her to smile, because he needed to borrow steadiness. From somewhere, Commonwealth versus Howe, the clerk called. The judge entered. The district attorney lifted his chin. The corners of his mouth tipped in something like victory in advance. Detective Holbrook sat 3 rows behind him, posture precise, eyes flat. Lena felt the tug to stand and shout his name like a curse. Instead, she reached for the thermos to give her hands a job and found the cap of it unscrewed. The coffee had leaked into the bottom of her bag, dampening the folder edges. She swallowed hard, gathered what she could, and smoothed the pages with her palm. The hearing started as they all did machinery grinding forward. The DA argued that the hoodie, the witness, the text, the timeline formed an unbroken chain. The judge nodded, bored or satisfied, or both. The public defender stepped up to respond, and Lena wanted to will fire into his voice. He talked about inconsistencies, about the camera that malfunctioned, about the dispatcher's missing call, about Ty's recantation that had been half allowed and half ignored. He mentioned the new materials the defense had recently received and the request for time to examine them. The judge lifted a hand. "You've had time," he said. His gavel might as well have been the lid on a coffin. Lena stood before she knew she was standing. A sound left her small, raw, and somehow it became words. "Your Honor." The room turned its face toward her like a single body. The public defender flinched. The DA's head tilted with pleasure at the spectacle of a desperate mother. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Hawley, you are not counsel." "I know," she said, voice steadying as if it had found a rail. "I'm a nurse and a mother. But I'm also the person who found what your courtroom hasn't been allowed to see." She held up the first photograph, not to him, but to the gallery, to the air, to the idea of witness itself. "This is the red cap that was found near the scene. You've heard Detective Holbrook testify belonged to my son. Inside the band are stitched initials, R.M. Raymond Maddox. You haven't heard that name because the police never said it out loud, but he was in the alley that night. He is in the background of Eames' photos. He is on Ridgemart's camera before it glitches. He is in my phone records, leaving a message that said I was getting too close. I found this cap on a table in a warehouse with printed police reports. That shouldn't exist outside a locked evidence room. There are also photographs of my son taken from bush across our yard. We were watched, and then we were chosen." A murmur rolled through the benches. The judge banged the gavel. "Order. Counsel, control your witness." The public defender, pale, whispered, "Mrs. Hall, please sit." But she was already walking toward the rail, each step a decision. "Your Honor, the chain of custody log for this cap shows Detective Holbrook's signature 2 weeks after an earlier entry by a different officer. That earlier entry places the cap in property on a date when Holbrook was not assigned to the case. The signature is not his usual hand. I compared it to other filings. The slope is wrong, the pressure shallow, I am asking the court to allow immediate examination of the cap and evidence for DNA, and to compel testimony from the electrician who maintains Ridgemart system and the dispatcher who wrote and then erased at 10:39. Call from the logbook the night of the murder. The judge's stare tried to bend her into a seat. The day rose, veins taut. This is theatrics, Your Honor. An emotional outburst. If the defense believed any of this had merit, they would have. The door to the courtroom opened at the back with a tired squeal of hinges. Lena turned with everyone else. Delgado stepped in the ex-cop, whose first meeting with her had smelled of coffee and regret. And behind him, smaller, hands clenched like they were holding the edges of courage, came the dispatcher. The judge frowned. The DA's mouth set. Delgado spoke without being asked, voice carrying in the hush. Your Honor, permission to be heard? The judge pinched the bridge of his nose and waved a hand as if the whole day were a headache. Briefly, Delgado lifted his chin toward Holbrook. I served with Detective Holbrook. He covered for a runner named Raymond Maddox Ray for years. We were told Ray was useful. Useful meant he got things done when official channels were too slow, and in return, things disappeared for him. Reports, warrants, trouble, the night. Tommy Reeves died. There was chatter on a city band about a cleanup at Kenner's. I filed a memo. It's gone from the system. I still have the printed copy I took home, because I started taking copies home after my stuff kept vanishing. He took a folded sheet from his jacket. The courtroom exhaled like it had been holding breath for months. The dispatcher's turn came off a whisper. The 10:39 call was real, she said. A man said not yet and hung up. I wrote it down while the line still crackled. An officer told me to mark it as a test. I don't know why. I'm sorry. The DA found his footing. Your Honor, again, hearsay, disgruntled ex-employee, frightened clerk. This is not how we adjudicate. He turned triumphant to Holbrook. Detective, please clarify for the court. Did you ever falsify a chain of custody log? Holbrook didn't blink. No. The judge nodded as if he'd expected the simplicity. Lena's mind threw out sparks. The cap, the initials, the date. She needed more than a photograph. She needed what photographs could promise. Then unseal. The evidence, she said, looking at the judge, not asking anymore. If I'm lying, the fabric won't hold what I say it holds. The judge stared back long enough for silence to turn into pleading. Then, with the reluctant cadence of someone who suspects the inevitable, he said, we will recess for 1 hour. The cap will be brought up. Both parties may observe a swab. If it seems there is reason to examine further, we will decide then. His gavel fell again. The room broke like ice under a boot dot in the corridor. The DA's voice hissed at her shoulder. You will regret this. She turned, not softly. I already regret everything I haven't done yet. Beyond him, through the tall windows that made the hallway feel like an aquarium, she saw the line of reporters assembling on the steps, microphones like spears pointed at the doors. Among them, to the left of the marble column, a red cap. It dipped once, like a nod, and vanished into the crowd. They were back in under an hour. A cap, sealed, sat in the center of the evidence cart, like an artifact lifted from a tomb. The property clerk slid on gloves. The judge leaned forward for the first time that day. The clerk lifted the plastic, slit the seam, peeled back layers. The cap lay there, ordinary and obscene. The clerk turned the band inside out. Even from the gallery, Lena saw the letters arm a little crooked, as if stitched by someone who'd learned on their own. The D didn't look at it. Common, he said. Initials are common. The defendant could have... The clerk interrupted softly. There's hair. He reached with tweezers. Gloved hands, gentle the way people are with evidence or newborns. The judge gestured. Swab. The state's tech and a defense-hired lab rep moved like awkward dance partners around the table. The swab disappeared into a tube. The judge said, "We will run a rapid profile. This is unusual. So is today." The wait was an hour that felt like a season. Reporters swarmed outside between updates. Holbrook sat like a statue, only his jaw. Muscle ticking. Jordan didn't move much, except his fingers, which made a small rhythm against his thigh, a quiet, stubborn drumming. Lena wrote and rewrote the same words in her notebook. Hold steady, hold steady, hold steady. When the tech returned, he did not walk to the state. He walked to the bench, passed the paper up. The judge read. He did not speak immediately. He read again, as if the letters might rearrange into a version of the world he had imagined before. Then he cleared his throat, and his voice, when it came, had lost its thunder. The DNA profile on the recovered hair does not match the defendant. It matches a known profile in the system, Raymond Maddox. An active warrant will be issued. Detective Holbrook. And here the judge's eyes hardened in a way that made the room recalibrate its center of gravity. You will remain seated, pending a review of all chain of custody. Procedures overseen by your hand. Bailiff. The sound wasn't a gasp. It was a collective release, like air leaving a building through every window at once. The DA spoke, words scrambling to assemble a new narrative. Your Honor, even if the cap belongs to Mr. Maddox, it does not preclude. The judge lifted a palm. The court will not proceed as if nothing has changed. The motion to suppress the cap as evidence against the defendant is granted. The motion to compel testimony from the Ridgemark technician and the dispatcher is granted. The court invites the Commonwealth to reconsider its position. What happened next wasn't tidy. Truth never is. The electrician testified to the battery backup and the software log that showed a manual pause. The dispatcher cried and apologized into a microphone that finally let her voice exist. Ty stood in the back and said the words he should have said. Months earlier, I was scared. They told me I'd be charged if I didn't remember it their way. Delgado produced copies he had kept in drawers and glove boxes and under a loose plank at his kitchen floor because he'd learned the hard way that paper in certain hands dissolves. And somewhere on those steps outside, the man in the red cap ran out of room to stand in the shadow of other people's stories. The DA asked for time, which was another way of saying he could feel the ground shifting. Time was granted, but it arrived preloaded with consequences. When the Commonwealth came back, it did not come back with its shoulders squared. It returned with a motion of its own, to dismiss all charges against Jordan Howell without prejudice, a maneuver that left its pride a place to hide and let the courthouse pretend it hadn't been part of the harm. The judge stared at the paper, at the room, at the boy in orange, then said, granted. Lena didn't hear the gavel for the sound that rose out of her, an animal noise that turned into a sob that turned into a laugh. She moved without feeling the movement, and then Jordan was in her arms, and the chains, for the first time, were coming off. On the steps, a storm of microphones, a blur of faces. Someone shouted questions at her. How did you do it? Did you know? It would work. What will you do next? She felt Jordan beside her, smaller than his height should allow, and she thought of puddles that looked like mirrors and of how people could live, their whole lives never learning to look properly. She said what she could into the microphones, voice steady because it had learned how. My son is innocent. He always was. We were not saved by luck. We were saved by refusing to stop. A reporter with a network badge nodded at the camera, then turned to the lens with the polished rhythm of someone who had practiced terrible days and good ones in equal measure. We'll continue following the fallout from the Hall A case and the widening investigation into evidence handling here. In Maple Ridge, if you've been watching and want to be sure you don't miss what comes next, stay with us, follow along, and keep this channel close. In the weeks that came, the town learned how many things had been true all along. Holbrook was suspended, then charged. The DA announced a review panel and called it reform. Ray was arrested at a bus station 3 counties over wearing a cap that wasn't red anymore. At night, Lena sat at the kitchen table and didn't need to write in her notebook to feel like she was still holding her son's life in her hands. Jordan took his camera outside again. He came back with a photograph of a cracked storefront after rain, and when he developed it in the school lab that had been left unused all semester, he brought the print home and set it on the counter. "Look," he said, pointing to the edge where a child's hand reached for a reflection. "Most people would say it's just a window, but if you stand here, you can see the whole street and the sky and even us, just a little." On a humid evening in late summer, they walked past Kenner's and the alley where a town had decided it already knew how the story ended. The new camera the store had installed glowed a steady green. Halfway down, Lena stopped with the light stopped and the shadow began. She didn't feel smaller there, not anymore. "You were right," she told Jordan, "about mirrors." He smiled the way you smile when a truth finally fits back into your body. "About mothers too," he said. She didn't ask which truth he meant. The exact words didn't matter. Later at home, she closed the notebook and slid it into a drawer. Not to forget, but to make room. On the counter, under a magnet shaped like St. Mercy's old coffee pot, she pinned a scrap of paper with a list that had nothing to do with phone logs or chain of custody charts. Buy better shoes. Learn how to sleep again. Call the electrician. To say thank you, send the dispatcher flowers. Pick up Jordan's portfolio appointment. Return Delgado's napkin with the address scribble. Outside, a siren passed, and then quiet came back and stayed. The town would always keep its secrets, but fewer of them belonged to the wrong people now. Some nights, Lena still woke to the echo of a gavel that had sounded like a closing door and discovered, with a small, fierce joy, that today it sounded like an opening one. On those nights, she sat by the window with the lights off and watched the block-breathe porch lamps faint and human, someone's laugh slipping through an open screen, a dog throwing itself at a dream. She thought about other mothers in other towns who were just beginning to walk the corridor she had walked and wished she could put a hand on each of their backs. Keep going, she would tell them, without saying anything at all. Keep going until the door opens. Keep going until the story you live is the story you tell. And keep someone with you who refuses to look away, because there will be days when you need to borrow their steadiness dot at the edge of sleep. When her body finally trusted the dark again, she would sometimes hear Jordan in the hall, barefoot. On wood, the click of his camera like a small, forgiving metronome. And every time, even half-dreaming, she smiled, because it meant the world still had mirrors in it, and a boy who knew how to look.